Chapter 6. Continued. Her feelings toward the boy suddenly wrenched, turned completely another way. She had been prepared to deal with him as a tyrant, as a monster, as a haughty superior. She had not been prepared to deal with him as a child, asking for help. "How can I help you?" she whispered. "I don't know my way," he said. "You will, in time." He looked impatient, more frightened. The mask was coming off his face. I've lost my voice." She did not understand. Wasn't he speaking to her? "Kya," he said. "I can't sing anymore." Of all the people on earth, only Kya could possibly understand what he meant, and what it meant to him. "Not ever?" she asked, incredulous. He shook his head, and tears came to his eyes. The boy was helpless, still beautiful, the face still impossible not to look at, and yet now a real child, which in her mind he had never been before. Lost his voice. Lost the one thing that had made him a success, where Kjaran had been a hopeless failure. She was instantly ashamed of her excitement. She had never had it. He had lost it. And she forced herself to compare his loss to her losing her intellect, on which she depended for everything. It was not imaginable. McCall's songbird, without singing. "Why?" she asked. In answer, a tear came uncontrolled from his eye. Ashamed, he wiped it off, and in the gesture won her to his side, whatever side that was. Someone had done something to Ansett, something worse than his kidnapping, something worse than McCall's death. She reached out to him, put her arms around him, and then said words that she had not thought ever to recall to her mind, let alone to her lips. She spoke the love song to him, in a whisper, and he wept in her arms. "I'll help you," she said afterward. "All I can, I'll help you. And you'll get your voice back. You'll see." He only shook his head. Her chest was wet where his head pressed against her. And then she led him to a stilt, and stroked the panel that called the elevator. And as it descended, she held him at arm's length from her. "My first help to you is this. To me you can cry. To me you can show anything and say anything you feel. But to no one else, Ansett. You thought you needed control before, but you really need it now." He nodded, and almost immediately his face became composed again. The boy hasn't forgotten all his tricks, she thought. "It's easier," he said, "when I can let it out somehow." "Now that I can't sing it out," he didn't say. But she heard the words all the same, and while he stood alone and walked easily beside her through the buildings, where anyone could see them, in the enclosed bridges that connected the buildings, leading them back to the manager's quarters, he reached to Kya and took her hand. For years she had hated Ansett as the epitome of everyone that had hurt her. It amazed her how easily that hate could dissipate, just because he let himself be vulnerable. Now that she could hurt him, she never would. The chief of staff was beside himself with joy at Ansett's return, but he spoke to Kya, not Ansett, as he asked, "Where did you find him? Where was he?" Coldly, Ansett said to the man, "She found me where I chose to be, Calip, and I returned when I chose to come." Deliberately, he turned to Kya and said, "Please meet me at 8 o'clock in the morning, Kya. I would like you to be with me through tomorrow's meetings. Calip, I want my supper at once." Calip was surprised. He had been so much in the habit of giving Ansett his schedule and introducing people to him. It didn't occur to him until now that Ansett would have things his own way. After a moment of embarrassed inaction, Calip nodded his head and left the room. As soon as the man was gone, Ansett looked at Kjaran with raised eyebrows. "That was pretty good," Kjaran said. "McCall was better at it, but I'll learn," Ansett said. Then he smiled at her, and she smiled back. But in his smile she still saw the traces of his fear, a hint of the expression on his face when he had pleaded for help. And in her voice, as Kjaran said goodbye, he heard friendship, and he was, to his own surprise, certain that she meant it from the heart. Perhaps, he thought to himself, I may survive this after all. Chapter 7. "It's very important," said the minister with the Latin portfolio. "There has been bloodshed. 30 people killed that we know of, and 10 of those in open combat." Ansett nodded. "There's another complication, sir. While the Uruguayans and Paraguayans are willing to speak Imperial in this meeting, the Brazilians insist on speaking Portuguese. Which is absurd," the chief of staff said, "because the Portuguese don't even speak it anymore." Ansett had never understood the purpose of multiple languages. He thought of it as an aberration of history, which had luckily been set to rights years before. And here, on the capital of the empire, was a rather large nation that clung to an anachronism to the point of antagonizing those who had power over them. "Do we have an interpreter?" The chief of staff nodded. "But he's one of them. No one here speaks Portuguese." Ansett looked over at Kjaran, who smiled. She sat beside him, but deferentially pulled back from the table, appearing to be a secretary, but actually ready to slip him a note. She had been studying this problem for weeks for the outgoing manager. She already had in mind several compromise solutions to the border war, depending on how cooperative they were. Since the Brazilians were currently in control of the land, their cooperation was the key to any solution. But the Brazilians were famous for being uncooperative. "Bring them in," Ansett said. 2 envoys entered from each nation. Protocol in this case demanded that they enter in order of age of the envoys, so that no nation would seem to get precedence. Ansett noticed, however, that each team included one who was very, very old. Odd, the things nations were willing to invest their pride in. The chief of staff explained carefully the rules of the discussion. No interruptions would be tolerated. Any envoy who interrupted any other envoy would be summarily dismissed, and no replacement would be allowed. They would ask Ansett for permission to speak, and would listen politely to all other speakers. Ansett was surprised that such instructions were necessary. In the imperial court it was all taken for granted. Then everyone waited while the Brazilian interpreter translated the instructions into Portuguese. Ansett watched carefully. It was as he had suspected. The Brazilian envoys did not pay much attention to the translation. They had understood the imperial perfectly well. It was the sound of the language that fascinated Ansett. He had never before thought of shaping his mouth in just that way, using his nose to such good effect. It enticed him. As the interpreter spoke, Ansett formed the sounds in his mouth, felt them in his head. More than the individual sounds, he also sensed cadence, feeling, mood. The language was expressive, and without understanding the intentions of the language, he knew he could use it well enough to accomplish his purpose. As soon as the interpreter was finished, the envoys all lifted their hands slightly off the table, palms facing Ansett, asking for permission to speak. Ansett impulsively turned to the Brazilian ambassador and began to sing. Not the music he had performed so often before. This was speech considered as song, and Portuguese language used for the sheer sound and power of it. If there were any recognizable words in it, it was an accident. But Ansett spoke on and on, delighted that he had not lost the power of imitation, working carefully to make this simple song touch the Brazilians as he wanted to touch them. The Brazilians, one ancient man who did not seem altogether alert, and a younger man with a look of resolute determination, were startled to hear their own language, then puzzled to try to decipher it. Even to them it sounded like perfect Portuguese. But it was double talk, and the younger one looked angry for a moment, thinking he was being mocked. By then, however, Ansett's tone had got through to them. They felt that despite the nonsense of his words, he was speaking affection and understanding to them. "This is a beautiful language," he seemed to be saying, "and I understand your pride in it." What would have been mockery by anyone else was high praise when spoken by Ansett, and when he at last fell silent, looking intently at them, the Brazilians both arose from the table, walked around it, and approached Ansett. The guards in the room, at least as puzzled by what had happened as anyone else, fingered their weapons. They relaxed, however, when Calip raised his hand, motioned them to relax. The old Brazilian first, and then the young one, embraced Ansett. It was an incongruous sight, the old man clinging to the beautiful boy, and then the tall, younger man bending to touch his rough cheek to Ansett's smooth one. While they were in the embrace, Ansett murmured in Imperial, "I beg you to speak Imperial so that the others can understand us." The man smiled, stepped back from Ansett, and said, "The manager Ansett is too kind. No other governor has troubled to understand our love for our country. He has asked me to speak Imperial, and for his gracious sake, I will." Kya, no less surprised than anyone else, could not help but notice the look of consternation on the interpreter's face. She was sure the Brazilians had planned a strategy of using the interpreter as a means of pacing the meeting, controlling it to their own purpose, since whenever anyone spoke, the interpreter would cause a maddening delay. Now that was discarded, and the pretense that Brazilian envoys spoke no Imperial would have to be abandoned for good. The meeting proceeded, and gradually the envoys laid out their cases. In the troubled Paraná region, the original inhabitants had spoken Spanish, and now, millennia later, they still did. However, in the last 400 years, Brazilians had asserted hegemony over the region, successfully, since, before Macal made Earth his capital, there was little planetary government, and there were few restraints on national governments. Now the veneer of Portuguese was wearing thin, as the Spanish-speaking majority began to resent the greater and greater pressure on them to give up their language. Complicating matters further, the people in the north spoke the Paraguayan version of Spanish, which was unintelligible to the Uruguayans. There had been a lot of talk about self-determination for years, matched by official Brazilian statements about one nation indivisible. The talk had finally turned into bloodshed, and the Uruguayans and Paraguayans were demanding that the Brazilians hand over their territory. Unfortunately, the territory was a hydroelectric paradise, and the Brazilians did not want to turn over the 50% of their non-solar energy to other nations. And when the envoys had finished presenting their case, Ansett asked them to prepare in writing a one-page summary of what they think a just solution would be that would meet the needs of all the parties to the dispute. Then he dismissed them until after he had had a chance to read their proposals. In private, the minister with the Latin portfolio was effusive. "How did you do it? What did you say to them?" Ansett only smiled and said nothing, turning his attention to Kya, who had scribbled furiously throughout the meeting. "The disagreement really isn't insoluble. They don't want opposite things," she said. "The Brazilians want to save face to maintain their borders. They're very tight on this, and they need the energy. But the others are simply asking for preservation of culture. They want the Spanish-speaking citizens to be allowed to dominate in their own country. They don't need and can't really use the hydroelectric energy in the area." The Latin minister nodded, agreeing with her. They began drawing up the proposed compromise even before the envoys' proposals began arriving. It was evening before the envoys were called back. Kjarn was delighted with the way Ansett looked, as fresh and cheerful as he had in the morning, as if no work had gone on at all, as though the solution to their problems seemed easy. Ansett read his compromise to them, providing them with copies when he was through. "Let us study this," said the younger envoy from Paraguay. "I doubt there's need," said Ansett, following Kjarn's advice. "This is very little different from your own proposal. Indeed, we were quite pleased with the fairness with which you approached the problem." Ansett began parrying the various objections skillfully. Kjarn and the Latin minister had already gone over with him very carefully which items could be altered and how far. Ansett's voice was reasonableness itself, gentle and friendly and warm, speaking of love and appreciation to the envoys. "Thank you for being willing to give a little on this point, in the interest of peace, and on this point, you can see why I cannot give in, because it would be intolerable to the others, and justly so. But we can't give here. Would that help? Ah, I thought it would." Each envoy was completely convinced that Ansett was their advocate in the discussion, and when it was finished, late at night, the clerks prepared a fair copy of the new agreement, and all the envoys and Ansett signed it. "Ever?" she asked, incredulous. He shook his head, and tears came to his eyes. The boy was helpless, still beautiful, the face still impossible not to look at, and yet now a real child, which in her mind he had never been before. Lost. "Chapter 6. Can I help you?" she whispered. "I don't know my way," he said. "You will, in time." He looked impatient, more frightened. The mask was coming off his face. I've lost my voice." She did not understand. Wasn't he speaking to her? "Kya," he said. "I can't sing any more." Of all the people on earth, only Kya could possibly understand what he meant, and what it meant to him. Not continued. Her feelings toward the boy suddenly wrenched, turned completely another way. She had been prepared to deal with him as a tyrant, as a monster, as a haughty superior. She had not been prepared to deal with him as a child, asking for help.